Alright, so I know I've talked about these games before, twice even, but seeing as my girlfriend so graciously gifted me DreadXP's DreadX Collection 3, god that's a mouthful, I suppose it is time to revisit the franchise, and all 13 new games. That's right, we're doing this, the whole kit and caboodle. So grab a snack and something to drink and join me in finding out if this review is a product of blood, sweat, and a whole lot of tears, or if the only thing I'm dreading is a lack of a part 4. I'm your host Arlyeon, and this is all of DreadX3. Anyways, given this is another game collection, I'm going to be tackling this in the same vein as the prequel videos, which you can check out the link in the description. Namely, I'll be spitting out some rapid-fire reviews of the various titles which make up the whole, including the game selection hub, since it takes the form of a full-on spoopy castle. That's right, this place serves as the narrative backbone for DreadX3, helping to tie together the events of all 3 games, all while exploring an awkward but charming buddy comedy involving a shattered eldritch entity and its helpful host, which I found oozing with charm. I was distinctly charmed, not mind-slaved. Charmed! Oh right, but the castle. Yeah, so it houses a fairly enjoyable array of puzzles to solve, the crux of which are unlocked once you play your first minigame. Mostly because solving these puzzles also provides you precious currency in the form of candles you'll be using to unlock access to the other games housed within DreadX3. I mean, you can opt out all of that and just do the free play, but really, I found the castle to be a genuinely solid part of the experience and would highly recommend against skipping it. Seriously, I had enough fun that I neglected the other games for a decent span of time once I got started on puzzle hunting. I had cobwebs to clean and a Saturnian cat to pet. But I mean, I did eventually get on track, so let's chat about the games you'll be encountering. One of the first I picked up was Basalt Tower's Matter Over Mind, a stealth-oriented adventure that sees you controlling a nefarious brain-hijacking jelly in a story-light romp through some sort of lab. That's about as far as the story go, and as far as the experience go, I wasn't the largest fan of this one. Whilst the concept of jumping onto unwitting scientists to hijack their bodies and use their security clearances to advance is a novel concept, it's not a fun one in execution. Your host bodies shamble oh so slowly, which isn't really a meaningful design decision, given that the guards are completely oblivious to you when you're just sitting on someone's head parading around their brain in your see-through guts. And also least most, that would be utterly counterintuitive to a stealth game, like diving onto a scientist or a corpse in the middle of a guarded room. Frankly, most of my deaths were due to platforming or jumping issues, given you need to hold and release the button to glob around. That said, there were a few times where I wound up clipping through walls or getting a host body stuck inside a table while I was in a locked room, which leads you to losing all your progress past the tutorial area. Yay! So, yeah, basically, I had an issue with this game. A lot of issues with this game, and after beating it, I also felt like, in hindsight, all the effort I spent on collecting the weird DNA collectibles was a bit of a waste. TLDR, whilst it's a quaint concept, I didn't really have fun with this one at all, which is why I chalk it up to a fail. Then there's Corpse Pile's Submission, which follows a fledgling game developer's attempts to beat a deadline. Really, I'd say more, but it's hard to say much without spoiling the whole premise, as a number of its plot elements and gags really work best by experiencing them firsthand. I will say it's a fairly compact experience, which manages to balance both being funny and charming while still injecting some genuinely creepy moments into the mix as you progress. And as far as outcomes go, I can't name any other game that's made fuck apples sound metal as hell. Now, gameplay-wise, it is a bit of a slow burn, as the game's, air quote, tutorial, end air quote, isn't quite reflective of what you'll be doing. Rather, the gist of the game functions more akin to a puzzle game that'll see you exploring and figuring out a few clues to advance. Though, the outro flips that script again in a segment that I found at once ridiculous yet fun. So, overall, I thoroughly recommend checking out this title, and I think it more than warrants being called a solid hit. Now, the next studio I'm going to be mentioning is apt to be familiar to DreadX veterans, as it's another title by Torpilduke, the creators of Hands of Doom. This time, with an FMV-styled point-and-click adventure called Chips Tips. In it, you're tasked with hosting a party for all your friends, something which is made all the easier due to the helpful tips left by your dog, Chips. If this is all sounding eerily reminiscent of Blue's Clues, you're not wrong. given that the entire thing plays out like an unsettling homage to the series. Though only somewhat, given that whilst there certainly is a creep factor to be found in Chip's tips, especially as you progress, the game manages to be both charming and hilarious throughout, and incredibly dorky. Though, when I say game, I do have to acknowledge that it's incredibly simple. It would be summed up as some minor exploration and a series of fetch quests. All the same, it's a charming endeavor and one that never overstays its welcome, which is ultimately why I dub it as a hit. That said, if you're a fan of simplistic game design, maybe you'll find yourself drawn to Moya Horror's Nice Screams at the Fun Fair, a ghoulish game that sees you doling out ice cream at the unfair fun fair. Though, that might be a generous description of what you're doing, given the actual process of doling out orders of ice cream is a hit-and-miss endeavor at best. Literally. I can't count the number of times I tried to serve up a scoop only for it to bounce off the cone, or simply pass through it like a ghostly gob of gelato. Which only compounded the already tedious process of endlessly serving up matching orders of ice cream to your corpsey clientele. Heck, I think I embraced my comical demise at the hands of my robotic feline overseer the first time it happened, if only because it meant a brief bit of freedom from the rigors of work. Sadly, the twisted form of work ethic saw me playing the game to explore both the endings it had to offer, not counting being buzzsawed. One of which left me completely flabbergasted at how nonsensical it was, and the other which saw me slowly walk away from a monologuing mannequin in a sequence that rivaled the game's prolonged intro. Which is to say, this title went above and beyond to earn itself a solid fail. Alright, so next is Nate Barron's Sato Wonderland, a short story-driven experience that puts you in the role of a diagnostic analyst at a theme park. The primary goal of the game is to investigate a violent incident that occurred with one of the animatronics by matching up various keywords to generate unique bits of dialogue and new lines of investigative queries. Whilst this one is also driven by a fairly simplistic gameplay, I still found myself compelled to dive in deeper, if only due to its narrative strength. The gradual unfurling of the mystery was a genuinely enjoyable process, as were the different ways in which the story can conclude. This was definitely one of the more memorable titles in the compilation for me, and it strongly merits being called a hit. Moving on, we have Among 26's bequeathed. What I'd best describe this as a mini-game-laden walkabout that follows in evenings in the show of some hotel desk staff. Whilst this certainly has a cutesy aesthetic to it, there's definitely some disconcerting elements to be found as you progress through your various cleaning errands, culminating in a truly unfortunate and altogether weird segment that more or less flips things around in a way I hadn't expected at all. Overall, I'd say bequeathed makes for a novel experience and one I did enjoy. Still, whilst I can understand the role the busy work plays in establishing the tone, I do wish there'd been a lot more variety in the cleaning tasks, which is ultimately why I rate it as a fumble, albeit a stronger example than most. Nonetheless, this puts it in stark contrast to Blood Machine's action platformer Soul Waste. Normally I'd spare a moment to offer up some insight on the story, but the deep lore for this game is esoteric at best. Which left me mulling over the game, to focus on the fact that it falls flat on its face as far as platformers go. Partly because controlling your character feels tantamount to ice skating while drunk to the gills. The game managed to make basic movement a horrifically painful task due to the manner in which your character rapidly gains acceleration while your ability to maneuver tanks. Combine that with a general inability to come to a rapid stop, and it's a recipe for disaster. I actually found it surprising that the game rewards you for hitting things while moving quickly, given how difficult it is to line up an attack while zipping along. Really, the only thing I did enjoy about this game was its aesthetic. Even that didn't last. In part because I found myself stuck in a bullet hell-esque boss fight that went on for friggin' ever until I figured it out. Which, yeah, I rate this game as a fail, because I wouldn't recommend playing this to anyone. On the other hand, there's Adam Pipe and Victor Krause's cute contender, Spookware at the video store. Seriously, the intro consists of some adorable skeletons chilling out and deciding they want to lounge and watch spooky videos together. It's super wholesome, and also just serves as an excuse plot given that the gameplay is essentially a randomized series of minigames a la WarioWare, these being the videos. Frankly, I really dug this title a lot, partly because of the premise and just the fact that it was cute and enjoyable, but also because it had a decent variety of challenging minigames to learn, which only got harder once the game started speeding up, and also once I was actually alternating between the keyboard games and the mouse games. Oh, and the unlockable unlimited mode is pretty neat. All in all, this was a delightful entry in the collection and one that I can call a hit. Then we have Bregan Hackett's Bubba Adventures on Geralds Island. In this, you take the role of a humble delivery person who's found themselves stranded on an island with an extremely friendly and equally suspicious community of robe enthusiasts. What ensues is essentially a platformer, albeit with a number of collectathon-oriented objectives, though I definitely had questions when it evolved from collecting coins to rat skulls to kidney-shaped fruits. Also, that dialogue, it's actually pretty solid as far as cute but unsettling goes. Frankly, I dug the story to this game a fair bit, including the final sequence and what ensues. Plus, it was just satisfying to play given it handles so well. This game is essentially the opposite of Soul Waste as far as responsiveness goes, especially when it comes to just how nice the jumping controls are. In fact, my only real point of frustration with this game was just how damnably hard the true ending was to find, and that was essentially self-inflicted suffering because the collectibles you need for that are bastard hard to find. In any case, I still ultimately rate this as a hit. Next up, there's Bryce Boucher's indie platformer Disparity of the Dead. In this, you take the role of a ghostly gumshoe, tasked with figuring out why people are no longer finding their way to the afterlife. It's a weird story, to be fair, and one which had me absolutely baffled by the time I reached the outro. Honestly, the conclusion was more or less a conga line of confusion for me. Still, its gameplay is relaxing enough, as you essentially are tasked with wandering the underworld, collecting spirit fuel, and talking to people for clues you can save. Honestly, my biggest gripe, other than the narrative weirdness though, is the fact that the process of collecting spirit stuff gets really tiresome by the end of it, and scouring the entire map to search for missing caches was annoying at best. All in all, I definitely think it has merit, but I had some pretty mixed feelings about it, and to who I'd recommend it to, which is why I ultimately rate it as a fumble. And speaking of weird, we then have Modus Interactive's Eden Garden of the Faultless, which, so this is a story-light endeavor, but the gist of my experience was that you're tasked with raising and racing fledgling Seraphim. Thankfully, without resorting to the weird sort of inbreeding antics that seem prevalent in chocobo ranches, though maybe with a little bit more cannibalism involved. Yeah. Anyways, this not quite cutesy game has you alternating between racing your small choir of angels and roaming through Eden feeding them miscellaneous grub. Just ignore the fact that they all look like eldritch abominations, probably because that's how actual angels are supposed to look like. So yeah, it's weird, and yet sorta wholesome if you don't think too hard on things, or engage in all that much cannibalism. I just wish there was more to do, given that a lot of the gameplay boiled down to clicking a button and waiting for the outcome, like clicking a tree to eat some fruit. And even the racing is pretty hands-off, which is probably why it ultimately boils down to a fumble for me. With all this said, that brings us down to the final game, which is Dirigo Games' Reactor. In this, you're placed in the role of an isolated operator on a research station in space, where you're whiling away your days with your robot companion, who's probably better at cards than you are. That is, until a peculiar meteor touches down near the base, heralding a peculiar series of events. Frankly, this is more of a walking and sometimes running simulator than anything, but I did enjoy my time with it, and the visuals are lovely to behold. And while I was able to predict the broad strokes of the story, the execution of it was still fun enough that I wanted to see it through. Though I'd be less apt to pick up the game a second time, I do say that ultimately it was a hit as far as the experience goes. It's just not something I think most people will pick up again. Anyways, that brings us to the conclusion, and I do have to say this entry in the DreadX series just felt solid. While there were some low points for me amidst its games, on the whole I had a lot of fun with this, and I iterate that hub area was oodles of fun, enough so that I found myself wishing there was more to do. Ultimately, I'd say this collection wound up being a solid series of hits for the most part, and I'm definitely hoping the illusion towards a DreadX 4 does in fact happen, even while cursing out my compulsive need to review these anthologies. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, link in the description, so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care until then, folks.